Hello, y'all. Welcome in. Thanks for joining us tonight for Griffin's talk on accessibility. Before we get started, if we could all just unmute and give Griffin a big welcoming applause.
That's in the beginning. Hey,
Griffin.
All right, beautiful. Thank you guys for coming. I'd also like to thank Single Sprout for sponsoring this tech talk. Can everybody see my slides and hear me all right? And just like a thumbs up, that'd be great. Beautiful. So my tech talk is on accessibility and the ally movement, a practice in empathy. The term ally comes from the space between the first letter and the last of accessibility. The Ally Project is on the forefront of the accessibility movement. They define accessibility as the degree to which websites are used by the broadest range of people, making the movement a facet of equity in the industry. At the moment, the Ally Project defines areas in need of attention as visual, auditory, motor skills, and cognitive ability. Assistive technologies touch many of the aspects of technology we interact with today, be it captions, Siri, night mode, transition from hoverboard to Segway, or as Stu pointed out in his tech talk, even the typewriter was created to adapt tech to an audience that had been before excluded. The Job Assistant or Access with Speech, JAWS, provides speech and braille for the more popular computer programs, greatly improving accessibility around applications. That being said, job applications are a predominant pain point in accessibility today. Other popular technologies implement a perspective centered around accessibility are screen readers and mouseless keyboards for the hard of sight and those struggling with motor skills. Dwell also provides an alternative to a computer's standard interface by tracking eye movement or the position of someone's head to enable mouse clicks, while Microsoft HoloLens, the top image in the slide, offers object mapping with audio cues to help sight-impaired individuals navigate buildings with a better idea of their locale. Most assistive tech is free or inexpensive. On Mac, we have Apple VoiceOver with Command F5, and on others, we have NVDA, which is an open source screen reader for Windows or Mac. Firefox, Chrome, and Safari's DevTools have begun adding accessibility tags, predicting how a screen reader would read the page. There are also free extensions in Validator, like Axe, which is an open source rules library that lives in the DevTools and automates accessibility testing. According to Stack Overflow's developer survey, 1 of 200 software developers are blind or hard of sight. Likely, people are left out of the survey, though, because of Stack Overflow's sometimes own inaccessible design. As of 2018, web pages are considered public domain and must accommodate Title III of the Americans with Disability Act. The Ruderman Family or Foundation, a disabilities rights organization, has called for all websites in the country to become accessible by the year 2025. And here we have some logos of companies that have been sued for not being in compliance with Title III of the ADA Act, their web pages specifically. By treating empathy as a muscle, a commodity towards inclusion, we can further frame our mindset to tackling these sorts of problems. One effective process is to enable a wide array of assistive technologies and to practice accessing applications and web pages through each lens these assistive tools provide. So I'm going to do that now for this slide. I'm going to deploy a screen reader.
Welcome to VoiceOver. Document content, edit text. That skill is empathy. Because what is design if it is not the practice of giving empathy a form? Design is putting ourselves in other people's shoes and solving their problems. John Brownlee. Well-structured HTML is accessibility's secret weapon. Ann Gibson. Insertion on word. Design. Between characters. Application. Entered text selection. Exited text selection. HTML VoiceOver left the meeting.
So you can see how even for myself and many others, the screen reader can be very difficult. So one of the things that I've done here that I'd like to highlight is that I moved the title box off the slides. So for presentations, it won't be rendered, but the screen reader will be able to have an overview of what this slide, the content of the slide. So that brings us into structure. Those title pages or those title boxes give a lot of semantic structure as well as the different H1 tags and using the hierarchy of information centered around HTML. Aside creates an opportunity to provide metadata that isn't rendered on the page, which can be styled with CSS and nested within aside tags. To provide further insight, an unstyled view is roughly the way a screen reader would read a page. So now I'm going to use a good example of accessibility and go to MDN. And so to get an unstyled view, what you can do is you can inspect a page. And if you delete the head, you'll have a better idea of how it's going to read by the screen reader. So with some web pages, this breaks. So if you are interested, after the lecture, I can give you a command that you can put in the console to also make an unstyled view. So when we navigate the page by pressing the tab, as people who are unable to use mouses would have to, we can see the way a screen reader would navigate the page. So it starts to go through these main headings. And you'll notice also that the links below have semantic meaning. It's not click here, but it's a name that describes what each of the links will lead them to. When it says here, it offers very little insight, semantic insight into what those links will lead to. ARIA stands for Accessibility Rich Internet Applications. There's roles which layer on top of existing markup language for elements that don't have implicit roles. And an ARIA role is prioritized by the browser over an HTML tag offering agency over how our page is read through screen readers. The ARIA figure role can be used to identify a figure inside page content where appropriate semantics do not already exist. And the ARIA label attribute is used to define a string that labels the current element. While properties give extra meaning or extra semantics. There are also states, which have special properties and define the current condition of an element. And there's ARIA hidden, which can have different elements read at differing times, like when you catch an error or when a browser's popped up. ARIA is best used with div and span elements, and it's best for elements where the semantic meaning is not implicit. Focus indicators, links from fields, widgets, buttons, and menu items, also helps somebody navigate through a web page by having it mimic the same sort of process of a sighted user skimming the page. To tell the screen reader to skip over unnecessary decorous images, add an alt attribute and leave it blank. For images, so here I have, another example of how VoiceOver would render the page. These are examples of the different labels that you can use in HTML to create better accessibility. So I'm going to
Welcome to VoiceOver.
bring our friend
VoiceOver
back.
speaks. Philip has joined the meeting. The way an ARIA label is created in HTML, as well as the syntax of skip links and focus elements, list box, exited text selection, application, table. You are currently on VoiceOver off.
So as you can see, there is alt text enabled describing the image, as well as just beneath. Another technique is to add information and a description so that it's not viewed by sighted users, but it can be read by screen readers. So moving on. Images, screen readers can't interpret the graphics. So without alt text, it's just seen as the file name. You can add that alt tag, you can add text around an image, and if not, as the last line of defense only, you can change the file name to make it have more semantic meaning. With charts and infographics and something that has more depth to it, you want to highlight the highlights and lowlights of the graphic and also the most notable parts. One technique that a lot of people employ is they imagine describing it on the phone. There are other tools like Color Oracle, and Twilio also has a colorblind mode that enables varying contrast to see how colorblind users might see it. Preferred over color contrast are shapes, labels, and sizes, perhaps patterns. So it's not color alone that creates difference in semantic meaning. Even though Trello has a colorblind mode, it also has a ton of links before the main content, which are not skippable, making it difficult for screen readers. Color Oracle allows you to grayscale a screen quickly to check for colorblind users. And there are different options for different kinds of colorblind users. You can also use WebAIM to check for accessibility standards. As a best general practice, you want to avoid variable names without context, avoid trailing spaces, as the reader will just read out each space, and try to use these short bullet points for its concision and clarity. So that brings us to our next point, and that is that a lot of language used around technology has very little concision. So when you use a link, you also want to give it the semantic meaning as opposed to this HTTP having this web address, because then it creates confusion for a screen reader. But as we can see with the Hemingway app, it checks for adverbs, passive voice, and hard to read sentences to see how well it's being read. To make your website more accessible, you want to have at most a grade 8 readability. With testing for accessibility, we have the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, as shown here, and with alt text describing in detail what is being read. But we can see where many of these web pages tend to fail. The Ally movement also has a web accessibility checklist, and you can host an Ally hackathon. You can also regularize accessibility statements through your READMEs and your open source projects, as well as on your website, to have a general standard of practice for accessibility within each application or product. So for checking accessibility, you want to check for contrast. So double check your color contrast ratios between the background and the text to help people who have blurred vision. And you can also manually check the resize function to enlarge the text on your site, either on Mac with a command and a plus sign, or on Windows, control and a plus sign. And it's essential and widely used by those that are hard of sight. You want to make sure the content is laid out in a logical tabbing order for someone who isn't using a mouse to navigate the site, and navigational titles must be clear and consistent. You also want to provide alternative text for images, of course. A detailed description of the image is always better for users using a screen reader. And you want to double check that form fields are labeled correctly with text outside of the field. Placeholder text inside of form fields often confuse screen readers, and it's best practice to avoid placeholder text altogether. Another practice that I'm a fan of, especially with building empathy, is building personas. So it's creating these characters, these ideas of people who have these different disabilities, and imagining the different ways that they might navigate your website. So now, finally, I'm going to move on to the future of assistive technologies. With our sights set to the future, we look at John Brownlee's predictions for what's to come. John Brownlee was able to successfully predict the deployment and development of widespread screen reading services to the masses in his article In the Palm of Your Hand back in 2003. And his estimations of the direction of accessibility in tech are as follows: that tech will move inside your head and become a powerful instrument for equality of access, a new tech stack with perception as a service, with tech personalization and affordability. He's saying that the experience will be built on an ever more application-rich and readily available technology stack in the cloud. As all that gets cheaper and cheaper to access, product designers can create and experiment faster than ever. At first, it will be expensive, but not for long, as adoption, probably by far more than simply disabled people, drives down price. That's a direct quote from John Brownlee. And that is my presentation on accessibility. So if anybody's interested, I'd love to be able to field some questions. Thank you so much.
Awesome job. Before we take questions, I'd love to just get one more round of applause in. So if everyone could unmute and give Griffin a large round of applause.
Keen on that.
Wow. Amazing.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Griffin, for that insightful talk on accessibility. And I saw there were some hands going up. So first, let's start off with Will Ramirez.
Hey, awesome presentation, Griffin. Love it. Learned a lot. Especially love the demonstrations. My question for you is, let's say you're a startup who's, growing and you don't know when exactly to start applying resources to, making your website Ally compliant. Do you have any insight there?
Absolutely. I think a lot of web accessibility, at least from my research, has come down to CSS and HTML, and having a better understanding of how each one of those elements work. And so I guess my suggestion for a startup company would be to maintain as you're moving along, because accessibility in web is a moving target, because you might have something that meets all of the web content accessibility guidelines, like to a T, but as soon as you start deploying pages and other things, then those guidelines change. So I would say focus on the hierarchy in HTML, and simpler is better, I think would probably be the best. But yeah, I think there's some company that their bottom line could have improved by $9.8 billion if they had just been able to reach out to the 15% of people with these sorts of handicaps. And so financially, I think it's a much better move to work with accessibility in mind. And considering that it's primarily done through CSS and HTML, I think it's a smart investment. But so I would focus on those two languages, I guess. To
Awesome.
start off with.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the question, Will. I love it. It's awesome.
Well, up next we have
Tyler.
Tyler.
Sorry.
Thank you. And shout out to you, Griffin, for doing an accessibility lecture. I mean, accessibility is a big deal, and there needs to be more light shed on the situation. My question has to do with the screen readers. I know that JAWS is one of the most popular, if not the most popular screen reader that is out there. However, for the visually impaired, there seems to be a lot of complaints coming from them about the actual reader. Is there any other screen readers that you would suggest, or that are that are slowly working their way up into the limelight underneath JAWS and possibly surpassing them?
Yeah, definitely. So one complaint I've heard of JAWS is that it can be pretty costly. So that's not here, but it's in my notes. So my suggestion actually would be NVDA, which I don't have here, but I have in my notes. NVDA, I believe, is free and open source, and it's a screen reader that offers, that is more accessible than I believe even the job access with speech. So I've heard some not so great things about job access with speech, but it's definitely an improvement over not having anything. I have some others that I just can't remember off the top of my head, but I'd love to be able to get back to you after the lecture. But also, I loved your presentation on UX yesterday. I had you in mind when I was working on this, so I was hoping you might like this one, Tyler.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it.
Nice. All right, next up we have Charles Rue.
Hey, Griffin, thank you so much for this talk. It was really informative. And I also really like the demo portion with the screen reader. I was curious about the screen readers. Do they handle things like hot module reloading and like window alerts?
So I guess not so much would probably be my answer to that. So that's sort of a responsibility of some of the software developers that want to implement those features. So with hot module reloading, when you have a screen reader and you go down to the next batch of items, it won't actually refresh the screen reader. So every time there's that reload, you need to be able to program something that notifies the screen reader that there are these new items on the page and that they have to be read. Also, they generally suggest against the use of modals and pop-up windows and they oftentimes have referred to those as some of the most inaccessible technologies that you can use. But it's a wonderful question. Thank you, Charles.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. And then last question, I think, Mike. What's up?
You'd mentioned that, say, like Domino's and Target have been liable under Title III of the ADA for having inaccessible websites. At what point in sort of the production testing cycle do we have to start being worried that, like, or putting it out there, do we have to be worried that we haven't implemented that yet, like, and we might be, have a legal, I guess you're not a lawyer, so maybe this isn't. But I just,
Yeah,
I think you get the idea. Sorry.
So I think it probably has to do with like the sort of the size of the corporation. It has to do with like publicly displayed web pages. So I would think some of these projects on GitHub, when you do open source, like I know, for example, when a lot of people do WordPress themes that they don't have to do or work with the accessibility in mind whatsoever. But if there's a larger company using it and it employs a WordPress theme that has that poor accessibility, they are liable for that. So I think it has to do with scaling, and then but also not to sort of derail, but I think it reflects poorly on some of those developers when it's something as simple as a tag or an alt tag or sort of thing. So I think as far as working in the field, that having that asset covered is probably a smart move. But yeah, so sorry, long answer short. I think it has to do with scaling mostly, but I can also get back to you and look into that if you'd like. Happy to do it. Thank you for your question.
All right, thanks, y'all. I don't see any more hands up, so unless somebody is super fast right now, let's give Griffin one last round of applause and head out of here and enjoy our weekend.
Woo!
Good
job, Griffin.
Yeah.
job. All right, y'all. Have a great weekend.